Hey guys, DJ Scholtes here from Iron Ridge Church. I just wanted to spend some time today talking about faith and actually one of the strongest statements of faith that we can make as Christians. Whether we've, just come to know who Jesus Christ is and we're starting to make the first steps in that journey, or if you're a seasoned veteran and you've been a professed Christian for a long time, I want to share a little bit with you. I was doing some reading this last couple weeks and I ran across this piece in Luke. And as I was reading through it, I saw this statement of faith arise. And I thought, that is some powerful stuff. And it comes out of Luke chapter 5, verse 12 and 13. So if you want to turn to that, I'll give you a couple seconds here. Just to give you some context into what's happening, by this point, Jesus has started doing quite a few miracles. He started to make himself kind of known. He's healed many people from their illnesses. He's cast out several demons at this point. He started gathering his disciples together. He started to do some things that started making a name for himself. And people started to know who he is. And we get to verse 12 and 13 in chapter 5, and we see this man with leprosy. And we've heard this story, well, maybe I know I have, but maybe there's a bunch of you out there who have heard this story hundreds of times, the man with leprosy who was healed. And we get to verse 5, chapter 12 and 13, something profound here happens that I think we as growing Christians need to understand, especially if we are wanting to continue to grow and we're wanting to continue on this path of sanctification, right? This path of working out our faith to be more like Jesus Christ. So in verse 12 it says this. Here's the story. It says, while Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. Now, at this point, what we need to understand is that the Greek word for leprosy didn't always necessarily mean leprosy itself as the disease. It could have been a whole multitude of skin diseases, things that were all over this man's body. And so that's what's being referenced here, is that this man came up to Jesus who was just covered in skin lesions and sores and illnesses and diseases. It could have been anything. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it was leprosy itself. It just means that there was a multitude of things on his body, on his skin, that was causing pain and causing illness, and it was diseased. So anyway, it says, he came to Jesus, and when he saw Jesus, he fell on his face to the ground and begged him, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him. So those two verses, there's a lot to unpack here, first off. But I think what tends to happen is, first, we as Christians tend to go to verse 13 and say, well, that's faith. It says, Jesus reached out his hand and touched him and said, I am willing. Be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him. I think we look at that and we say, well, that's faith. That's what faith means. My faith means that I know Jesus' power and that he can heal me. And so I'm going to have faith in that. And then we believe that's what faith is, that somehow faith had reached a point to where we utilize it in our hearts to obtain a positive outcome, right? We get in the car and we go to work and we believe that faith is going to get me to work without that person veering into my lane and running into me at 50, 60 miles an hour. That's faith. I got to work safely. Faith got me the positive outcome. And then we start to build our whole lives around that to say that faith must mean positive outcome. Faith must be that. And that positive outcome then feeds into my emotions. And so then I operate solely on this idea that faith is an emotion-based thing, and so then I apply it that way. So I only have faith and I only utilize faith when my emotions are going to be fed or when my emotions are hurting. If I'm in a negative emotional place, I'm going to rely on my faith to get me through it. And if I'm in a positive emotional place, I'm going to say, look what faith did for me. And this seems all well and good, and I don't want to take away from the fact that faith does produce outcomes that give us abundance and that do give us life. But I think this is a very dangerous slope to get into, because what we're seeing in verse 13 is Jesus healing based on faith. But what we're seeing in verse 12 is the most profound statement of faith that a man can make. And I think it's one of those statements that you and I need to come to know how to make in our own walk. It says this in verse 12. If we just go back and reread this, it says, while Jesus was in town, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. And when he saw Jesus, he fell to his face, and he said this. This is the statement, and this is where it begins. Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. So let's stop there and let's break this into pieces. Lord, if you're willing. This is a man who knows that Jesus is God. He says, you are Lord. I know this. But if you're willing, this man is introducing God's will into his faith first. He's not saying that that's secondary. He's not introducing his pain first. He's introducing God's will first. He's introducing God's sovereignty first into the equation. He's saying, Lord, if you're willing. Imagine just in the last week how many statements of faith we made that started with that, or how many statements of faith that we could have made that could have started with that. Lord, if you're willing. Maybe you're at a place where your job isn't fulfilling you mentally and emotionally, or maybe you're in a place with your marriage or your kids, or something else is going on, and you're just saying, God, I have faith that you're going to get me through this. But what if you started that statement and said, God, if you're willing, you will get me through this? Just think of that for a second. But it doesn't stop there, right? That's only half of it. We get to the second part that says, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. So this man is introducing into the situation God's will and his sovereignty, and then he's moving into the second part to say, you can do this. You can make me clean. You can heal me. He's not saying, Lord, if you're willing, can you help me? He's saying, no, if you're willing, you can. So this is really confident faith that comes in this. It says, God, if you're willing, you can make me clean. What this man is doing is he's putting his faith on the front line to say, you know what? I'm going to have faith that God can do this, but what I'm doing first is I'm putting God's will first. I'm saying, if you're willing, you can do this. Now, there's another piece of scripture where this is very prominent, and we've heard this hundreds of times. Lord, if you're willing, take this cup from me, but let your will be done first. It seems that even Jesus Christ put his faith in God's will first instead of the problem. And it's this positive outcome that we constantly go to. It's this positive outcome that we constantly reach out towards. And then we attach faith to that. We say faith and positive outcome matter. But what we need to do is, if we're going to grow as Christians, if we're going to grow in our faith, what we need to first understand is that faith and positive outcome cannot go together first. It has to be faith in God's will first. It has to be faith in what God desires first. And when those two things get married, when those two things come together, then we move towards the outcome. And if the outcome is positive, great, we're healed, everything's perfect. But if the outcome is not what we desired, that's the point where we can look in the face of death. We can look at the face of pain and say, yeah, but it wasn't God's will. And so I still trust God. He's going to take care of me. He takes care of the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. He takes care of them. How do I believe that he's not going to take care of me? So if faith is always a positive outcome and we're always working on our emotions with it, if faith is always an emotional thing, then faith is going to run from us the moment it is needed most. And that's when those dark times come up, whether you have cancer or if you have lost a job or you've lost a loved one. Or maybe just life is falling apart around you and you go to rely on faith. Well, guess what? Faith's not there because you put it all in emotions. You put it all in the positive outcome. And now what we have, though, is we have this man who has leprosy saying, God, if you're willing, you can heal me. But he has to know that if God wasn't willing, then he would have walked away from that still with leprosy. But I believe that man's faith would have still been just as strong. He could look in the face of death. He can look in the face of pain and say, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. But even if you don't, I'm still going to follow you. So as Christians, I want to encourage you to look at this piece of scripture and try to find that type of faith in your heart. Try to work that out in your heart. To continue to say, God, if you're willing, I know you can do this. But if you're not willing and you don't do this, I'm still going to have my faith rest solely in you.